I want to introduce our next speaker, and just as I said earlier, we don't do long introductions because we want you to have the chance to hear from the speaker, and you can find information about more of their biography. But I want to tell you, this is Dr. Andy Hines. He is the Associate Professor and Program Coordinator for the University of Houston's graduate program in Foresight. He has 30 years of professional futurist experience, and he is an author. He's written several books, including The Knowledge Base of Future Studies 2020, Thinking About the Future, and several others. He is a member and was the founding chair of the Association of Professional Futurists. So join with me in welcoming Dr. Andy Hines.
Thank you very much. All right, so I guess we're going to hack the future today. We don't use mushrooms or crystal balls or any form of magic. It's hard work. Right? What we do is it's simple, hard work. But the good news is I'm going to give you 13 tips today. I guarantee you there's at least a couple things you go, we can do that tomorrow. Okay? So you might not be all 13, but there's a couple in there that you're going to say, boom. So if we go ahead and call up the deck here, there we go, beautiful. Tip number 1. So how do we explore the future? Systematically. There's methods for doing this, just like in any other discipline, right? If you want to send a rocket to the moon, you follow a methodology. So we have the same thing in the futures realm. We have methodologies. We all think about the future. We all do it all the time, every day. What's the difference between, quote, you and a professional futurist? We just have some methods to do it a little more systematically, right? Now, this is our fancy version of the 6 steps that I just showed you in the flow chart. And I'm not going to go through it, but I'm going to tell you there's really 2 things we have to do. If you want to explore the future, first you've got to create your map. What might the futures look like? And we say as futurists, it's a good idea to have maybe 3 or 4 stories of how the future might be different. So the first half of the work that we do as futurists is mapping the future. And then the second half of that is influencing it, saying, all right, which future do we want to work towards? Which futures might we want to avoid? And how do we do that? And not only how do we do that, what can we do tomorrow? So one of the key principles of futurists is even though we look far ahead, our job is to connect that back to what can we start doing right now to kind of get us on that road. So we believe in acting right away. Okay, last thing on the first tip is, how long does it take to do the future of an exploration? So we're about to embark on a project in the future of libraries. We just finished one on visual storytelling, which is kind of like movies in the metaverse and all that stuff. We've done construction. It doesn't matter. We did the future of communities, which had a lot of ties to what you're doing in local government. The way that we work it, our particular methodology takes about 15 weeks, about 6 people, me, Laura, who's going to speak in a little bit, and a team of students, and we can knock it out. So it's not super complex. You can do it, it's cost effective, it's affordable, and you can do it right now. Okay, so what else do we do? So you might say, well, to these futurists, give us a little bit more concrete on how futurists work. So a couple years ago, many disciplines now use competency models to say, what do we all agree on are the basic things you should learn in doing your discipline? So a few years ago, I worked with a team, and we came up with 6 basic Foresight competencies. Some of you alert listeners said, hey, didn't their model had 6 steps? Yes. So we've based the way that we do the future is we use our competencies. And obviously as a graduate program, we're also teaching people how to do it. So it's kind of nice, right? Here's what our professional association agree are the basic competencies for how you do futures work. We teach our students that, and we use it in our project work. So one of the things, like if you were goofing around before this and said, well, how do people do their work? You might have seen all kinds of different ways. So here's tip number 3. There's a variety of, you might have seen 50 different ways you could explore the future, and you went, oh no, I'll never figure all this stuff out. Nuh-uh. Once you understand, these 6 basic competencies, right? Now, obviously there's variations on it, but the 6 basic things, you got it. And everything else is really just a variation. So there's some core ways that you explore the future. You do 2 things, you map it, and then you influence it. So already you're halfway to a master's degree in about 10 minutes, right? And you can see all the different tools. Now, there's another interesting thing. So we actually do research as an academic program every now and then. And I went back and looked at 30 years of Foresight methodologies and said, what do futurists actually use? So we have these big, long lists. And I went back and looked at the historical big, long lists and did a bunch of smushing and synthesizing and came out and talked to people. Most of us practitioners use about 3 to 5 different techniques in our daily practice. You don't need to know 50 things. So if someone says, we don't know, you don't need to know a lot of things, right? Each practitioner tends to fall into a couple basic techniques they like, and they use them. Now, sometimes you get bored, so you try something new, and we're always fooling around with new techniques to kind of keep it interesting and maybe come up with some different insights. But that's a luxury. That's a fun thing. So there's some core things that we agree on. They're pretty simple, they're pretty basic, and we get to fool around a little bit, but you don't have to know 50 different things. So don't be confused by all the stuff that's out there. It's fun, but you don't have to do it. So now, let me take you through, those are the first 3. Let me take you through the basic 6 things that we do. What does every futurist more or less do? Now, we don't do them all the same, and we might call them different things, but we basically we start off by framing the project. How are we going to do this? We're going to look at the future of libraries. How do we get our hand? Can you imagine doing the future of communities? We did it for North Carolina Credit Union. Like, how do you even define community, right? Woo-wee. So, in the beginning, you think, how are we going to map this out, right? What's the first thing a futurist thinks about? Time. This little thing, this is the simplest tool, that you could imagine, but it's so handy. And if you get this, we're going to come back and refer to it a few other times in the presentation. 3 horizons. All right, what do you need to know? Strategic fit. How well do we understand what's happening in the world around us? When we say the first horizon, hopefully, which we would define as the next 2, 3, or 5 years, hopefully we have a pretty good idea of that, right? We pretty much know what's happening around us if we're paying attention. Horizon 1, strong strategic fit. What happens? Over time, eventually the current way of doing things starts to not work anymore and it starts to degrade. And then new ways, second horizon, start to emerge. Right? Now you can see, what this graphic is saying is we can see the second horizon right now. We can see it right now. We just can't see it as clearly as the first horizon. The signs are there. And in our experience, in most, domain is our fancy word for topic, so if we use local government, in most domains that we look at, if you do your homework, you find out that there's about 5 or 6 major potential disruptive shifts in every domain. And you do your homework, you do your futures work, you see, here they are. And it's a small number. Now, what we can't tell you is, exactly how they're going to come together, which one's going to be a little more prominent, and exactly when. But we can absolutely tell you what are the major potential game changers in any domain, and it's usually a pretty small number. That's pretty cool, right? So when you say, I'm worried about getting hit by something out of the blue, ain't going to happen, not if you do this homework. You'll see them. They're right there. They're right there if we want to look. Okay. What else can we see if we do a look? The third horizon. You can imagine, the third horizon now, we barely can tell. And one of the reasons we get sort of confused and scared about the future is we mix up the third and the second horizon. The third horizon is all the crazy, wacky stuff that might happen in the long-term future. And every day, it's good, exciting media stuff, My favorite is almost every week, and you check me on this, there's a new breakthrough on plastic-eating microbes. We've had breakthroughs in that for the last 30 years on a weekly basis. As far as I know, we still don't have plastic-eating microbes. But every week, some new lab says they're going to do it. Okay? So the third horizon is all the stuff that could happen someday. And again, most of it won't happen. So let's do one quick example of what's a good example of how something starts in the third horizon and it eventually makes it to the mainstream. Self-driving vehicles. We've all heard about self-driving vehicles, right? It's not quite here yet, but we've heard a lot. We've been running some trials, and we've been starting to do them. It's getting closer. Almost every major vehicle company has said they're working on self-driving vehicles. One of my first projects as a futurist in 1993 was I went out to GM and worked on what we called back then intelligent vehicle highway systems. Back then, we thought we were going to put like sensors in the road and the cars would follow the sensors anyway. Turned out not to be the right way to do it. But that was 30-something years ago. So here's the promise. You do your Foresight homework, and something that, if you're not paying attention, it's like, where did these self-driving vehicles come from? They've been around for a long time, if you're paying attention. That's our promise, right? If we pay attention, if we look, we can see things, and they start out in the third horizon, and when they hit that second horizon, now we go, now we better start paying attention, right? Third horizon is interesting. Second horizon is maybe it's time to start doing something. First horizon, it's too late, right? I mean, there's not much you can do once it's here. Okay, there's the whole promise, right? So how do you start an exploration? If you're going to go explore, the mountains or the moon or something, right? You get a map. I don't know, you wouldn't explore the moon, but outer space, right? You start with a map. Now again, I said 3 horizons was a simple technique. I mean, I don't know if you can get much simpler than creating a visual outline of your topic. But I started doing this with every project about, 10 or 12 years ago. Oh my God, it's so helpful. Same thing, most topics, there's about 5 or 6 major areas. Like, if we're gonna understand this topic, there's about 5 or 6 kind of categories that we really need to understand if we're gonna understand the future of that topic. And then there's some subcategories around that. So when we do a domain topic, if we were doing the future of local government, we'd identify, all right, what are the main 6 areas we're gonna look at, some sub-areas, and then what's this thing orbiting around it? We call it STEEP. And it's like, it's a shorthand for just saying, like, what's all the stuff around the topic that might come in and influence it? It's not really directly part of it, but, the metaverse, right? I mean, the metaverse is not really local government, but the metaverse is happening and it's going to influence local government, okay? And what futurists do, essentially, the client knows this domain area, right? They know their own domain, typically. We know the external context. We put those 2 things together and the beautiful music happens. And that's essentially how that's a core idea of how this future thing works. We know the external context, you know your context. Let's tell the story of how those things come together. And so what does a domain map look like? I told you we did, this was construction, right? In this case, we kind of did it as a life cycle. So if we want to understand the future of construction, how do you plan projects? How do you design them, staff them, build them, all that kind of stuff. And then when and I'll show you in just a minute, then when we go look for what's changing, we use this map to say, all right, how is operating changing? How is the construction process itself changing, right? And it gives us a way to kind of orient how we explore this, what seems like an unknown domain of the future. So it helps us. It gives us a nice tangible thing, not only to help our team organize, but then we show the client and say, here's what we're going to do. Does this look right? Well, fix that. We iterated a few times, and then we go, voila. If you like tools, I know this is an eye chart. I know some people like tools. We use Coggle. It's basically like a mind mapping tool. So when we create our domain maps, we create a kind of a messy one, and then, of course, we show the client the nice one. But if you like it, it's a free cloud-based tool that we use to create all of our domain maps. And we do a little bit more detail for our own map because we want to use it to go find what's changing in the domain. What we say, the search for signals of change. Okay, so how are we doing? Oh, good. All right. Second thing, so we framed up our project. We know how far, now here's my experience is, and I've done probably a couple of 100 projects at least over the years, right? 10 years is a nice time frame. It's not too far, it's not too close, it's kind of just right. Now, of course, the communities project, we did 2040. We did a project in the future work in 2050. Things got really weird in 2050. But usually 10 years is enough. It stretches you, right? Okay, but it's not too far out that your clientele goes, because if you go to 2040, they're like, it's too weird, right? Too weird for me. 10 years isn't too weird. Okay. So we go 10 years out. What do we have to do? We have to look for signals of change. Now, we asked. So, we teach this stuff, so you think we're pretty good at it. About 10 years ago, we're like, we're not happy with our scanning. Let's ask. Let's gather together leading scanners and say, how do you do it? And boy, there wasn't much. Everyone seemed to have their own, like, I like these sources, But what they did tend to do is these three things, right? How do you find stuff? Now, Google's a good start, but that's not the only way. Once you find an interesting, we say, what are you looking for? Signals of change. Once you find the signals of change, how do you collect it? I'll show you that in a second. And then, we won't get into it today, but then how do you know it's any good? And that's like, you got to kind of go in the classroom for that, but whatever. Now, this is really interesting. So, we've been working with the CDC on setting up a scanning system, right? So you see, what's the output? You see two things, strong signals and weak signals. The reason I mentioned this, and I told them the first day that we started doing this, I go, CDC, you guys are all the smartest people in the world in your disciplines. So when you scan for signals of change, you're going to want to go for strong evidence. What do the experts say? What's the consensus? What are the main journals? I go, you're never going to find anything interesting about the future in that. You're going to find what? Horizon 1, the established system. So when you're scanning, it's almost counterintuitive. You're looking for weak signals that tell you how the future might be different. Oh my God, right? You mean, so you're looking at bloggers? My God, they're not reputable. Yeah, but where does change happen? It happens on the edges, right? It always starts on the edges and it works its way towards the mainstream. So if you start in the mainstream, you're never going to find any change, rarely going to find change in the mainstream, right? So by definition, you got to go to the alternative sources. And they were like, oh, we don't want to do that. And I go, yeah, I know. But they laughed, right? Because they knew it. They knew they were going to have that problem. Okay, so that's one of the things we do. In scanning, we're okay with less credible things that are less mainstream, less acknowledged, because those are probably, not that everyone is true, but they're their first signs of where things might be different. On the edges, not in the middle. So we collect them. I love this little thing, DIGO. I don't know if we have any DIGO users in here. It doesn't matter what collection mechanism you use, but this one is a nice one, and it's free, and it's cloud-based, right? It gives you a little icon-y thing where you can, if you see an interesting article or on the web, you can tag it and enter it into the DIGO like in 90 seconds or less. And so every time we do a project, we start what we would call a scanning library of our signals of change, right in the beginning. Okay, let's look at what's changing in this space. What's happening? Now you're going, ooh, H1, H2, H3. Here come those three horizons again. And we distinguish, when we look at these signals of change, we go, yeah. No, it's easiest to find horizon 1, right? Because that's what we write, what's mostly in the media and the literature, right? Established system. And we say that's not, we're not as interested in that as futurists, but it's not like it's bad information, right? It's useful. So we capture it. What we really want is that Horizon 2 stuff, right? Because again, those are the disruptions that are coming at our client that they better be ready for, because those are coming. They're not here yet, they're coming. And what a nice ratio there. That's actually pretty perfect, which is probably why I picked this one, right? Nice balance between 1 and 2. And then you can see Horizon 3, always harder to find, right? I mean, maybe not harder to find, but a little less useful to the client, right? What might happen in 60 years, who cares, right? The client's like, whatever. So it's usually fewer of those. But just using those little tag things, so then when you go back, we usually scan for maybe 3 or 4 weeks in a project up front, right? Then when we step back and say, what do we got? We can say, all right, give me the one, what's the Horizon 1 stuff that's already here? What's the crazy stuff? And then what's the Horizon 2 stuff just right? Okay, what else do I want to say? I think there was one more thing. Yeah, so you can see this is my a screenshot of my bookmark bar. And you can see I like to listen to digital music and they use Google Analytics. But DIGO, it's like this little, you go to the site, you take the icon, you just drag it onto your bookmark bar, and look what it allows you to do. So this is beat the country that passes no law, right? It takes, like I say, 60 to 90 seconds to put it in there, And you have a whole scanning library of those. Like in a typical project, we have around 200 or 300 of these, roughly. Depends. We had like 500 for the movies one. But anyway, and you write, you cut and paste in the little description, you tag it using our 3 horizons. What else do? We use our domain map categories. Remember in the beginning, we say, here's how we're mapping out the project. So that as we're scanning, we go, hey, are we covering our map that we all agreed at the beginning was a good, not to say that it has to, but it's a good guide to, let's make sure that we're neglecting an area, right? Because sometimes we'll have like too much technology and go, what about the people? Okay. So the tagging system will help using the domain map. So one of the things that you'll start to see is each of these steps logically flows into the next, and it ties together, and it's not hard, right? It's just, you just got to be disciplined about it. So what are some of the things we find? Just as a goof, right? You got to have we call it the obligatory Elon Musk hit, right? In every single project, we have to say one thing about what he's doing. And a lot of times, the client may not even care what's in the scanning library. It's for us to know what's happening. And usually, if we're presenting to the client, we'll have like a one-pager that says, here's some of the things we found. And they'll be like, oh, cool, right? Just make sure we have an oh, cool factor, and then we move on. But it's important to us because we use those signals of change to tell the stories about the future. Okay, cool. So the first thing, all right, so in addition to doing the scanning, there's some other kinds of research. We look for trends. We identify issues. We look at plans and projections. So there's some very specific type of information about the future that we'll identify as well. But the end of every project is we usually come up with somewhere around a dozen or so key drivers of change in that domain, right? Every topic has plus or minus 6, right? But it's around 12 drivers. And remember I was saying that there's some really basic rules of thumb. That usually is enough. Now this one, this is a student example. It was the future of beauty in Korea. We had a student from Korea. And these were 3 of her drivers, right? And one of the things once you get experience working in this game, what you start to see is there's some predictable themes. And we say that every study from now till the end of time is going to have something about AI in it. We're so sick of AI, we can't stand it anymore. But AI this, AI that. People don't even, I'm going to leave that alone. But you know what? You start to see patterns. You start to develop. So tech-enabled, right? Even beauty, there's tech-enabled smart beauty, right? Something to do with sustainability, a usual suspect. And it makes sense, right? Sustainability impacting more and more domains, right? It's a no-brainer almost. Inclusiveness, now she did this about 6 or 7 years ago. I think we know that that's upon us now. Okay. And you can see the little thing about inputs where we have those bullet points. And it basically shows us that these drivers are synthesis of like all the scanning we did, all the research we did. We laddered it up into these dozen or so drivers. What are we going to do with those drivers? We're going to tell stories about the future. But first, a little bit else we can goof around with in drivers, right? This is a project we did maybe 5 years ago on the exciting topic of trash. Oh man, it's so much fun. You wouldn't believe the fun we had. It wasn't as fun as the cats project, but we did the future of trash, right? And one of the points here about the future moves at different speeds, right? Sometimes people say, oh, it's fast. It's not all fast. Some of it's fast, but not all of it. Some of it's wicked slow. You guys are in government, right? I mean, we do a lot of work with government. I don't think you're worried about the fast pace of change within the government agencies, right? I mean, come on. We know that, right? So we say there's different speeds, and one of the ways to become a smarter futurist is just to acknowledge that. So like the slow stuff, the inertia, the Horizon 1 stuff, we say the Horizon 1 drivers are keeping change from happening. They don't want it to change, right? They're going to keep us where we are. Oh, we're happy with Horizon. We like Horizon 1. Okay. Horizon 3, these ones are a little different. So what do you mean by an aspirational driver? It means like it's a really big idea about the future that maybe isn't quite here yet. So again, we're looking at trash, right? How's trash going to be different? Well, zero waste. And this is like 5 or 6 years old. Zero waste. Big idea. Can you point to any zero waste facilities? I mean, maybe there's a couple. Granted, there might be a few, but it's not here yet, right? Oh, is any community doing zero waste? No. But is it a powerful idea shaping the future? Absolutely. Everybody's talking about how do we achieve zero waste, right? It's a big idea. So we call those the aspirational ones that are talking about how we could be, move into a new world, into a new system, right? So, all right. And then Horizon 2, we call them the momentum stuff, they're kind of already here and they're pushing us into the future. This thing as a service, you probably heard mobility as a service, this is a service. Our favorite, I'm just going to confess, we had a thing a few years ago for a client, parenting as a service. Why are we messing getting our fingers dirty raising the kids? Let's just outsource it, right? We can do anything as a service. Okay, anyway, that's a big trend. Do it yourself. Public Enemies was a fun one, and especially in the trash space, where it's like, remember it was straws for a while, and then it was plastic bags, and it keeps changing, right? But there's a new public enemy almost, not weekly, but maybe monthly. I'm not sure what the cycle is, but okay, the point is there's something new, right? It's always there's some kind of bad person, right? Okay. Anyway, so those are the Horizon 2 drivers pushing us into the future. So now we have a little more nuance. It isn't just a bunch of drivers. There's drivers that are operating at different speeds, and you can it wasn't that hard to figure that out. I'm sure other than you're probably going quantified and gamified trash. What on earth is he talking about there? And I'm going to admit that was probably stupid, but we're thinking like, in the future, like if you could, you would be charged by how much your trash weighed. So it would be a competition to see who had the trash that weighed the least. And yeah, probably people have better things to do than play trash games, but we thought so, right? We thought so. Examples of push of the present drivers. We already talked about that. Not all of our stuff, is okay. So the drivers, they came from the research, they came from the scanning that flowed out of the domain map. Now we want to tell our stories because we want to map what the futures might look like. Okay, so we use scenarios, which are basically stories about the future. Now, I told you about this 3 horizons things. We love it. We use it all the time. Here, one of the techniques that we use, and we did a study, there's about 26 different 26 different scenario techniques that are being used. Like I said, but most people use 1 or 2 or maybe 3, but there's a lot out there. The one that we use, what does it say? It's called an archetype technique. And it says the first thing, Horizon 1 is the current way the system operates. So in local government, what are the rules of game of local government? Obviously, there's going to be some variation, but we could probably come up with a list of the basics of how local government works. Horizon 1. We say that system, all right, let me back up. This technique says there are basic patterns of change in how the future unfolds. We've been looking at it for 70 years. We finally figured out what are 4 basic patterns. They're not the only 4, but they're 4 really useful ones. Pattern number 1, we call it the baseline, is the future goes straight ahead and there are no major surprises. No shifts. Present extended. Now, there could still be a lot of interesting things that happen, right? We have anyone that heard of Moore's Law about the doubling of computer power every 18 months? It's been going on for 40 years. It's why our smartphones, every couple of years, they're like twice as powerful. So, another 10 years of Moore's Law, and we got some pretty weird stuff happening, right? So even though there's no shifts, the baseline can still be interesting, right? Although usually our students complain, oh, it's so boring. Because you can't fix anything. It's the same system, straight ahead, no changes, no surprises. Now, we also joke it's the least likely future, right? No surprises in the next 10 years, good luck, right? But it turns out it's a really interesting mechanism to use with your people. Because if you ask most people, what do they think is going to happen, the baseline is what's in their head. So you say, here it is, here's what it looks like. Agreed. Yes, we agree that we kind of understand that. Okay, now that we've done that, would you give us permission to look at how it might be different? Well, okay. And this is literally what it sounds like. Well, all right. Here's 3 ways it might be different. sometimes the baseline collapses and things get pretty dysfunctional. Could happen. I mean, we peek out the door today, right? We are closer to collapse than any time, my 30 years of futurist, right? Things are a little hairy right now, so sometimes the system collapses. But don't despair, right? Because, one of the I think a very conventional wisdom is the only way to really significant change is you got to collapse first. You got to have the crisis, then we can do something new. So that's what that pattern says is it's got to fall apart before we do something better. So that's one pattern, right, of the baseline. It collapses. And for a while, there's no rules. We don't even know what to do. A second pattern is, the third pattern is called new equilibrium. Think of that as new normal. We've just lived through kind of a new normal thing, right? We went through 2 years of COVID, and Laura and I were at the beginning, everyone would say, oh, nothing will be the same, life will be forever. But we're like, nah, we've been through a bunch of these, and you know what? We'll probably reset. It'll be different, but it won't be that different. And I don't know. I would say that we're kind of in a new normal, right? We've adjusted to the pandemic. We've kind of, the traffic sure looks like it used to look like, right? Anyway, so new equilibrium says we get to the future by gradual adjustments. We start to change, and if you think of change as like we chicken out. Oh, wait a minute, no, that's too much change. Let's pull it back a little bit. And then a few years later, let's try to change again. And, it's like a gradual thing. So collapse is, it just goes to hell. We have to create a new system because it's collapsed. New equilibrium says we get there by stops and starts. Okay, and then the last one is transformation, the horizon 3, the long-term future. It's a whole new ballgame, right? New structure, new rules. All right? Okay, one more thing. So, of course, we have this. We had this little fun, our version of the archetype technique. What we say is there's basically these, here's how the patterns lay out, right? And we typically will do 2 versions of transformation since it's usually the most interesting. How could the long-term future be different? It might look like this, it might look like that. Anyway, that's basically all we're saying. Now, again, here's the good part of academia is, like I said, occasionally we do research too. So one of the things we've been doing is we've been going back and looking at historical scenario sets, like from the 70s, 80s, 90s, that talked about like 20 years ahead. And we look for patterns. And we have 78 scenario sets that we analyzed for how did they actually play out. Did they follow this pattern like we thought? And now, we're not done yet, but what's really interesting is we have found, as yet, collapse, it seems to be actually pretty rare that collapse will lead to transformation. It turns out it seems to be much more common that we go the gradual route, the new equilibrium route. Starts and stops, starts and stops, starts and stops. Now, it could be how we're defining them. We need to go back to the drawing board, but that was an interesting thing. We expected it was always collapse. It's not, which is good news, right? We don't have to collapse. Now, this one is actually a true example. So we did this project on the future of knowledge work. I think it was 2007. And, these were the scenarios. And they actually, we said it went from virtual teams to socially centric work, and now we're in this kind of personalized professions. And it's not 100% accurate, but it's pretty darn close. And it was out to 2020 or 2021. So interesting, right? So we think we actually have some evidence that these patterns of change are happening. We understand them, we can use them. Ooh, isn't this great? It's not a big mystery. It's not all right, we do our homework. We can get some sense of what it might look like. All right. So now we have our stories. Right? We have our sense of how the future might be different. Now we got to do something about it, right? That's, of course, the whole point of it all, right? So this one, I think, we use robots and automation so much. It's another one of those. Like I said, you start to develop a sense of rhythm and timing to the future. And, almost every study, like we do, cooking, robotic cooking, right? I mean, you could do it for everything, right? So, in this particular technique, we say, all right, let's not just identify the obvious change, but let's say what happens after that change. We call it the futures wheel, right? So, after we have more robots, What if we don't worry about the impact on humans? Humans get unemployed, ranks of unemployment swell, and we have things like calls for social responsibility. Now, sorry, I plunked it over. What 3B says is calls for corporate social responsibility. And what I plunked in there was, the opportunity for that was that, so what's the current, craze about social responsibility? It's the ESG stuff, right? So that says, if you believe this, it's probably a good idea to start thinking about how are we going to get ESG aligned, right? Because there's going to be problems. If we don't think about how people are going to be impacted by automation, as I like to think of it, this is a little harsh, but we can either watch the Minneapolis police station burn down on CNN, or we can do something else, right? Too harsh? All right, sorry. But I mean, what a stark image, right? When things go south, that's what we get, right? Okay, so the opportunity here for the client was to say, all right, you know what? We're going to align with these. Didn't say adopt wholeheartedly and stop doing everything else. We're going to get aligned with it. So I'm going to give you one little quick follow-up on this. What we mean by align is a really tricky word, because what we like are the way that we define it is maybe a little tricky. What have I learned? So I've worked on so many projects about the future. Here's a good time to use this example. I was at Kellogg's in market research in the 1990s. We did two major things that I worked on, a whole bunch of other stuff. One was, remember functional foods? It was like medical, you could put medicine into the food, and then you eat the food and you get, anyway, it was a big idea, like 1990s, right? So what do we do? It was already there before I got there, so I'm trying to avoid blame. But we built up this big division. 25 people, a new facility. We had functional pasta, functional this, functional cakes, we had like a line of 15 different functional products. We shoved it into the marketplace in like 1999, and we sold like 3 boxes of rice. We were like 25, 35 years ahead of the market. We went in big. We went in really big, right? Okay. The other thing, all right, so another project we worked on was natural foods. Now, natural foods right now, you're going, but 1997, if you can go back, 1997, if you can remember natural foods then, they were awful, right? It was like sawdust, compressed sawdust, right? The food was terrible, but you could see all the healthy trends, right? All right, so now in that case, what we did is say, rather than, like sell all of our pre-sweetened cereals and sell the Pop-Tarts, right, this is Kellogg's, let's just take our time. Let's make an acquisition. So we bought Kashi. Kellogg still owns Kashi. And made a bunch of acquisitions and just went really slow. We aligned, right? So part of the whole trick with this future is you don't necessarily have to go all in and be first, right? You kind of sense how, what's the sense of, use our 3 horizons. Where are we in the 3 horizons? How fast is it really moving? And let's get ourselves in that tempo. Okay, all right, that's the idea here. So ESG, what we said to our clients is we don't know if ESG is going to be the ultimate thing. May not be. There's a lot of different, we actually had a slide of 120 different metrics of, what. We don't know if this is going to, but what is undeniably true is if you do historical analysis, the movement towards something like ESG is absolutely undeniable. So whether it's ESG, I don't know, but is it going to be more corporate socially responsible? Yep. You can bank on that. Okay. So, designing, number 5. So if you don't have your version yet of elevator speeches, you probably do, because I think everyone does now. It used to be cool, but it still is cool. We use them all the time. So this is a set of scenarios that we did for NASA. It was the future work project for NASA. And from each scenario, we went through some methodology to identify a set of issues that we would think about. If this scenario happened, what would it mean for us? Basic stuff, right? Basic, how does this future connect to what we're doing? Now, I highlighted what I thought was my favorite. How do we get ahead of augmentation? Now, again, this had a long time frame, right? So it was like a 20-year, maybe even a 30-year time frame. So what do we mean by augmentation, right? Obviously, you can use CRISPR and DNA and chips and implants, and we start making ourselves different. 20-year, 30-year future, not now, 20, 30 years, right? And they were like, nah, no one liked it. It was very uncomfortable. And so what ended up helping us? We said, well, do you think, let's take it, who's your biggest competitor? China Space Agency. Do you think China's going to hesitate for like 10 seconds about augmenting their people? Well, no. So what are you going to do when China has a massive human augmentation program? Are you just going to let them win? Oh, no. Well, okay, so now's the time. Not saying we have to do it now, but now's the time to say, how are we going to respond? Right? It's coming. We know it's coming. They're gonna do it. So we have to decide how. Anyway, okay, that's the whole idea. And so the elevator speech tool is when we identify these various issues and we prioritize and think about which ones are important. We had one, how do we get ahead of it? And I thought, it doesn't really show up here, but it was really cool. Oh yeah, maintain a diverse mix of augmented and non-augmented. And what they thought of, you would have various levels of augmentation that was almost like various levels of education, right? So you have associates, bachelors, masters, PhD, and then you would have like a single chip, neural lace, completely, CRISPR, like you could have the same thing, and you could almost have pay grades based on, how augmented you were. Now, is that going to be the answer? Nah. But no, they went from this will never happen, this is a stupid idea, to at least having, now they're starting to go, yeah, well, all right, that kind of makes a little bit of sense, and it starts the conversation. Okay, so that's again, so we're taking that long-term future, bringing it back to the present, trying to find out what are the things that we might be able to do right now and along the way. And then finally, we adapt. Okay, this is another fun one. So one of the ongoing projects we had was with the U.S. Forest Service. We worked with them for about 4 years. And what we did is we helped them set up what we call a horizon scanning system, which is what I showed you, the scanning. How do you identify signals of change? That's all it is, right? Okay, the output of a scanning system, or the thing that they were most interested in, among other things, was what we call those emerging issues in Horizon 2, typically. So we're back to that Horizon 2. They're saying, yeah, we'll keep an eye on those long-term crazy things, but we're really most interested in the Horizon 2 stuff. You know what was really interesting? And I'm going to challenge some of you tonight if you want to go find it. They said, I go, what's your current issues so we know what's emerging, right? Well, we have that over here. And, a week later, I go, where's that list? Well, we're having trouble. Turns out they looked in their strategic plans. They looked everywhere, every policy. No, this is a federal agency. There are no slouches, right? They said, we have no list of the current issues that we're working on. I shouldn't be laughing, but it was like, so the first thing we had to do was say, all right, what do you, and now we were able to figure it out, and we created it. It was, oh yeah, well, we're working on, but it wasn't even like in people's heads. Like, what are we currently working on? Okay, so they fixed that. So then you say, if that's what we're currently working on, what might be the next thing? What's the next wave of stuff that we might have to get ready for? Okay, so has anyone heard of vertical forest? There's this Italian architect that started it. And basically what he does is he builds like trees and bushes and nature right into the building structures. I think I have a picture of it, so I'll whet your appetite. And it's as far as I know, for a long time, he was the only one doing it. So we said it was a Horizon 3. It was kind of a weak signal, because that's pretty odd, right? It's pretty odd. Well, let me just show you. Is it here? Yeah, all right, let me just show you. That's what a vertical forest looks like. There's about a dozen of them around the world. Now, that's pretty odd, right? Horizon 3. But if you think about it, you go, that's kind of cool, isn't it? You build nature right into the structure. It's going to take a while for people to warm up, so let's keep it in Horizon 3, right? And over the 4 years that we scanned, what we noticed was Stefano was the only one who's still building them. Now, I believe that we finally found the first non-Stefano vertical forest, but I need to confirm that. I think it's actually happened now. So that would tell us, aha, it's starting to spread into the mainstream. Now we start to get interested. Same thing here, coming age of wood. Among other things, the thing that got me interested personally was wood skyscrapers. Has everyone heard of that? You could build a skyscraper out of wood, and we saw the first thing we saw it in 2014. We're like, whoa, what the hell is that, right? Turns out, no, so we kept our eyes on it, and that has become a thing. Now, it's not mainstream yet, but it's the same thing. One of my friends works downtown in Houston, one of the major architecture and designing firms, and they were building one. I'm like, ooh, mainstream firms are doing it now. That says it's probably in Horizon 2 now. Again, maybe well, early Horizon 2, right? But it's interesting, right? So check it, it's actually happening. And so what we did with these, keeping track of, once we identified the emerging issues, we tracked them over a period of 4 years to try to see if they're, are they moving? If they started in Horizon 3, have they crossed in Horizon 2? The only one that we didn't really have anything that made it to Horizon 1 yet, although this forest, public and private health, I don't know, has anybody lately done a forest bathe? Oh, well, come on, get up with it, right? So you go out into the forest, and there's this whole technique you do is to regenerate yourself, covered by many insurance companies, and it's a way to revitalize. Now, it's not the only part of using the forest for health, but it's an interesting thing that's happening. So check it out, forest bathing. It's kind of funny. But it's happening. It's happening. Okay. So without getting into the geekiness of it, for each of those 6 issues that we the emerging issues that we identified, there's some ways you can track them. Are they actually moving anywhere? Right? So there's a way you can do that systematically. So we don't just guess, like we actually tracked it. Okay. We're almost there. So number 12, right? This is, I don't know, I just had to put this in there. Because, all right, so at the end of every project, we're doing recommendations, what should you do, right? So we did this project on the construction project, 2017, Future Built Environment. You can see down the bottom here, and this is there here. The last 2 recommendations were to do something about sustainability. Now this is 2017. Honest to God, I don't think I've ever been more shocked at how much resistance there was to doing environmental stuff by a client. Like, should this be a no-brainer in 2017, right? They're like, nah, not important. I'm like, what? And we had to beg to get it in there, and they let us stick it down the bottom because they're nice people, but they didn't believe it at all. They were like, it's a bunch of BS, right? Okay, now here's the good news. 2017, right? 2020, I get an email from them saying, oh, we at CII are going to do a circular economy project. Would you like to bid on it? I'm like, what? You just said this is all crap, and now you're going to do cutting-edge circular economy? Well, we've learned a few things. All right? And then in 2021, we actually got a project and did a project on ESG criteria. So sometimes you say, these agencies or organizations are so slow to change. 2017, they're like, no freaking way. Ain't going to happen. We're not interested. 2020, 2021, they're doing it. So what happened, right? I don't know for sure, but what we did, even though they didn't buy it, we planted some seeds in there, right? Maybe planted some seeds. I don't know. That's how I think. And then, once you plant the seed, then they start seeing evidence of it. Boom. Okay. So it can't happen. Last thing. Tip number 13. This is one of my favorite desert island slides. So one of the experts in systems thinking, Donella Meadows, was asked once, what's the most effective way to intervene in a system? And if we think of domain as system, let's allow that, right? There's really 3 major interventions. One thing you can do is you can play around with the numbers. We like that. Oh, we love playing with numbers and rates. And what she says is, yeah, it's really easy to goof around with rates, but it doesn't really change much. So we spend all of our time changing budget rates and calculations and tax rates. At the end of the day, nothing really, it's incidental, right? Now, second thing you can do is mess with the rules of the system. Ooh, now things start to get interesting, right? You start messing with the rules of the system, you start to get more change. But it's harder to do, right? It's harder to do. What's the most effective way? And I mean, I can, from my experience, I swear by it. You change the mindset of the people involved. Once you change the mindset, the rest of it's child's play. Once people say, as an example, we really need to be more sustainability oriented, I believe it in every fiber of my being, they will start changing the rules and they will start mucking with the metrics in that fashion. It's hard to go, so I'm already preaching the converted here, but right? The most effective way to change a system is mindset. It takes the longest and it's the hardest, but we should still be doing it all the time. So when we do recommendations, as a kind of way to close that up, obviously, we will give some recommendations around goofing with numbers, because people can go do something, right? We will talk about how do we, what are some of the rules of the system we might change, because they can do something a little harder, they can do it. And we'll say, but ultimately, we're working towards changing the mindset. And we know that's a long game. If anything, let me just say, if anything that you're thinking of doing says we need to educate the customer about this, you're screwed. It's going to take a long time. We used to do that in market research. I'm like, oh God, another one of those educate the consumer run. It's not that it can't happen, but it takes time. So be careful. Don't hinge your whole system on educating your clients or customers, because education is a slow process, as we in higher education are aware. So what do? We have a baker's dozen of tips. Hopefully there's a few things in there that you said, yeah, we can do this. And at the end, I'm going to leave you, before we have some time for questions, but I'm going to leave you with a 100% money-back guarantee that if you do your Foresight homework, you will not be surprised by the future. You will not be surprised. Laura and I, all of our students, we're bored. 30 years of doing this, I'm being a little facetious, but you see it, right? You see it. You see it before it happens. You see it in Horizon 3, 30 years before the rest of the world pays attention. Now, so you think, well, why does that happen? Well, because most of us are busy and we're doing other things, right? We're not paying it. No, our job is to pay attention to the future. But, in your job, why not, right? Should you be experts about the future of local government? You betcha. And in that domain, you can pay attention. Maybe you don't pay attention to the rest of the stuff, but you can do that. And if you do it, you'll go, oh, okay. Again, not that we'll get the timing right, not that we'll get everything exactly right, but there will be no wow, we didn't see that coming. You can't help it. You'll see it coming. So that's the guarantee. You'll see it coming. It didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere. All right. Thank you very much. We get time, 10 minutes, to do some questions.
Thank you. I'm Katie from the city of Stockton in California. And I'm curious, talking about the mindset and educating the customer. If our customer as local government is maybe first our residents, but then more closely our city council members.
Right.
How do you recommend anyone in local government kind of pursuing this work with elected officials who clearly have a very short window where their attention span is focused, whereas those of us in administration have maybe a longer time horizon to work with?
All right, so how do you educate your customer stakeholders about the long-term and a short-term attention span theater world, right? There is the conundrum of our existence, right? And I guess I would say, so certainly when we talk about that transformation future, sometimes we will craft that into something we call the preferred future. So it's just one of the techniques. And it's a technique that says, if we had our druthers, what would we like the world to look like? And then we fancy word, we backcast from that and say, all right, if that's where we want to go, what would be the steps to get there? And every 2 years, and is that going to convince them? No, but it might say that not only can, we can imagine where we want to go, because here's rule number one is most people have no idea where they're going. None. It's amazing. Well, what do you think you're going to be in 10 years? I don't know, right? Even as leaders, what do you think you'll be? I don't know, right? So, number one, try to paint. Now, when we say we paint that preferred future, we point out the other options as well. So it's not just like, oh, this is going to be wonderful. Here's the future. Because we say there's some bad things that could happen too, right? So it's realistic. It's plausible. We say, we could do this, and here's what it would look like. Do you want to go on the journey? And, it might take some time. They won't want to go on it tomorrow, but it's like it's that whole thing about you planting the seed, right? Oh, I could see that, and it's not. I think we could do that, right? And then just let it percolate, and do your measures and rules in the meantime. Good question. Good question. What else we got? I can't see because these lights are blinding me, so I know there are people out there, but. Right.
Hello, my name is Christina, and I'm from the city of Raleigh,
Of course
in
it
North
is.
Carolina.
All right, sorry. What?
Yes. My question is about the scope of a topic that you undertake with a futures project. How broad or granular should you be when you pick something?
How broad or granular should be when you're scoping a topic? Ooh, this is more art than science. But I'll give you an example, a real example with a client who was in the automobile field, right? So I said, well, let's try some different scopings. One thing we could do is the future of wheels. It's like really narrow, right? I mean, it's actually not a bad project. I think I might have said the future of, hubcap spokes or whatever. Anyway, really, and I said, or we could do the future of the world. And the client went, good. I went, no, that was my foil, right? We don't want to do the future of the world, and we don't want to do the future of, tire tubes or something, right? So and we had this idea that like there's an altitude, right? Like 50,000 feet, 40, 30. And one of the things we try to agree on with the client is how, what is our altitude? Now, I don't think there's a right answer. And what we say is like, for an example, if you want to do the future of work, that's 50,000, that's the top. The most researched subject in the history of the future. So I don't want, anyway. If you do the future of work, there's so many things that could happen there. So then we say, that's too high. What if we did the future of virtual work? Oh, now we're at 40,000 feet. What if we did the future of virtual work and the impact on urban areas? Now we're at 30,000 feet, right? And I think the process is one where we, the consulting, bring some advice, or and the client, we kind of got to go back and forth and try to set what that is. And remember I mentioned in the beginning, the future of communities. Ooh, right? It took us a couple of weeks. Now, in that case, it took us a few weeks to get the altitude right. Other times, like you'll do a project, the future of libraries, like, all right, done. I mean, that's an easy scoping, right? It's perfect. We'll see. But I mean, sometimes it's easy, sometimes you just gotta, and all right, one more thing on that. So we always say, so in the beginning, we do all that framing step, we start scanning and researching, and then we come back and go, oh crap. We didn't, and that's okay. It actually turns out this really isn't the topic. The topic is this. And we say, that's fine. We can iterate back. It's not like we've set it in stone, right? And we actually say, let's go out and look and then come back and go, how do we feel about it? Do we think we got it right? Yeah, it looks pretty good. All right, let's keep going. So calibrate, iterate, hope for the best. Okay.
I think we're about out of time there.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Hines,
All
very
right.
much. Very interesting.